The house on Maplewood Street had a quiet and welcoming appearance, with its large windows and white curtains that swung softly in the wind. The kind of house that seemed to have been taken directly from a fairy tale, where peace reigned and time seemed to slow down. The Warren family, consisting of Mark, his wife Julia and their children Emily and Ben, felt immediately at home when they arrived there. The move to the small town had been a decision motivated by the search for a more quiet life, away from the bustle of the big city. The house, old and solid structure, was bought at a surprisingly low price. The neighbors were kind and the street was always quiet, except for the occasional birdsong and the sound of leaves falling from trees in the colder seasons. At first, Mark and Julia thought they had made the right choice. It was the kind of place where children could run and play without fear, and where they could finally build their dream life. In the first nights, however, something began to bother. At first the sounds were subtle, a snap coming from somewhere far away, perhaps from the wooden planks of the floor or roof. But as the days went by, the sounds became more evident. During the night, when everyone was getting ready to sleep, Mark swore he heard something that resembled a low whisper coming from the wall next to the bed. At first, he thought it was just the wind, maybe an animal moving in the attic. But when Julia commented that she had also heard a similar sound, the doubt began to grow. Ben, the youngest son, seemed to be the most affected. He refused to sleep in his room and crawled into his parents' bed every night. "The man in the wall is talking to me," he said one morning, his eyes still dark from a night of bad sleep. When asked what he meant by that, Ben just shook his head and did not want to talk about it anymore. Emily, her older sister, also began to feel a growing discomfort, although she did not want to admit it. She used to walk the halls at night, saying that she was just going to the bathroom, but often it was as if she didn't know exactly what was pulling her into that corner of the house where the air seemed heavier. Over time, the whispers became more distinct. Sometimes they seemed to come from within the walls, other times from the hallway itself. And it was not only the Warren family that began to notice the sounds. The family dog himself, who used to walk around the house happily, now hid under the beds or in the corner of the room, with his hair frowning and eyes fixed on some empty spot, as if he was seeing something that humans could not. Julia tried to be rational. "It's just an old house," she said, trying to calm Mark down. "In time we'll get used to it." But in her heart, she could not get rid of the feeling that something was wrong. The whispers did not stop, and seemed to grow every night. That particular night, as everyone tried to rest, the whispers became louder. They were not clear words, but something in the tone made them even more uneasy. Mark stood up from his bed, looking around with narrowed eyes, trying to identify the origin of the sounds. He went to the door of the hall, with a fast heart, and went to the end of the house, where the sound seemed stronger. When he reached the basement, something inside him hesitated. The door of the basement was slightly open, as if inviting him in. That night was the first time Mark felt the weight of the house in its entirety, as if it were alive, and had its own secrets. He did not know yet, but that basement door, a simple access to the darkest part of the house, kept the key to understand what was happening, and perhaps, it was the only chance to keep his family safe. The next morning began like any other. The sun shines brightly, illuminating the trees around the house and filling the kitchen with the soft autumn light. Mark was sitting at the table having coffee, trying to get rid of the feeling of apprehension that still weighed on his chest. Julia, next to him, did the same. They exchanged sneaky glances, as if both knew something strange was happening, but did not want to admit to themselves that the situation was already beyond what they could understand. Ben and Emily were at school, which gave Mark and Julia a rare moment of calm. Mark, still with a feeling of restlessness, decided to go down to the basement to investigate the origin of the whispers. The door, as it had been last time, was only half open, as if inviting him in. He hesitated for a moment before slowly pushing it. The smell of mold and aged wood took hold of his nostrils. The space was full of boxes and old furniture, covered with white sheets that looked like ghosts frozen in time. He searched the boxes for something that explained the sounds, perhaps an old object or some kind of material that could be creating the crackles and murmurs. But what he found was something much more disturbing. At the bottom of one of the piles of furniture, an aged wooden box caught his attention. It looked older than the other things there, as if it was hidden purposely. Mark picked it up carefully, feeling a strange resistance, as if the box did not want to be opened. When he finally managed to lift the lid, inside it was an unexpected object, a diary, with the worn-out cover and a rusty iron clasp. With a sense of déjà vu, Mark opened it and started reading. The diary belonged to a child named Emily, a girl who lived in the house many decades before, in the 1930s. As Mark's eyes went through the words, he felt a shiver run through his spine. Emily spoke of voices she heard in the house, voices that became more insistent as time passed. At first, the whispers seemed friendly, giving her advice on how to improve her life, how to be a good daughter, how to behave. But as the pages moved on, the words began to change. Today, the voices told me to cut Ben's hair. I didn't want it, but they said he would look better like that. I just wanted to please them. They are my friends. Mark paused for a moment, swallowing it dry. The voices that Emily heard in the house seemed to become more demanding, more threatening. She began to distance herself from her family, believing that the whispers understood her in a way no one else could. I don't want to talk to my mother anymore. They said she doesn't understand me. They said I'm special. Mark continued to read, each word more disturbing than the previous. Emily was beginning to believe that whispers were some kind of higher power, something that led her to do things she didn't understand herself. The diary became darker as Emily moved away from reality. Today, they told me to do a terrible thing. I don't want to do it, but they said that I'm the only one who can do it. Mark stopped reading, feeling a growing pressure on his chest. He looked around as if the house was listening to him, expecting some reaction. Then, he heard. It was no longer a distant whisper, but a clear murmur coming from the dark of the basement. You know what you need to do. Mark jumped back, the diary falling out of his hand. The sound of footsteps echoed around him, but when he looked, there was no one. Terror took hold of him. He knew that he was alone there, but the air seemed to have become heavier, denser. The diary was open before him, but he felt as if something invisible was watching him, watching every movement. Desperate, Mark took the diary and quickly went upstairs. He knew he couldn't stay there any longer. Fear took hold of him, but he also felt something more, a need to understand what was happening. As a growing obsession, the need to continue reading and find out what had happened to Emily consumed him. That night, when he met with Julia, he decided to tell her what he had found. When he said Emily's name, Julia turned pale. She remembered something, a story I had heard years ago about a child who died mysteriously in that house. A child named Emily. The dread began to take hold of both, as if they had dug up something that should remain buried. I don't know what's going on here, Julia, Mark said, the voice trembling. But the whispers, they won't stop. And now they know we're listening. In the days following the discovery of the diary, the atmosphere in the house became even more oppressive. Mark and Julia, although they tried to keep a normal appearance for the children, felt that something invisible and threatening was watching them every step of the way. The whispers, once subtle and scattered, were now impossible to ignore. At night, when the house was quiet, voices began to emerge from the walls, louder and clearer. They were not only murmurs, but complete sentences, said with an almost familiar tone, as if the very spirits of the house knew their deepest fears. She's coming, she always comes back, you'll be like her. These words, said in an almost sweet tone, but laden with imminent danger, echoed in the minds of Mark and Julia. They tried in vain to rationalize the situation, telling themselves that they were only being influenced by the diary and the tension that was building up around the house. But the more time passed, the harder it became to ignore the signs. That night, as the house seemed to breathe around him, something even more disturbing happened. Mark was lying in bed, trying to fall asleep, when he felt a sudden pressure on his chest, as if an invisible hand were pressing against him. His breath became heavy, and for a moment he had the feeling that he could not breathe. But as he looked around, there was no one. The pressure was gone as quickly as it had come, but the feeling of being watched remained, like a constant weight. "Mark, did you hear that?" Julia asked in a whisper, her eyes wide with fear. She was awake, staring at the ceiling, body tense. "What?" Mark asked, voice failing. He knew she felt it too. It wasn't just the house that was changing, but they were also changing. The presence was becoming stronger, more aggressive. I heard a child crying. From somewhere in the house. Mark looked at the door of the room, which was ajar. The house, silent during the day, now seemed to have life of its own, as if it was waiting for the right time to reveal its darkest secrets. They were being led into something that they could not fully understand. The next morning, Mark and Julia decided to go down again to the basement, determined to investigate more deeply what was in that house. The feeling that the answer was there, among the shadows and old objects, was almost palpable. They had no more doubts that Emily's diary was just the tip of the iceberg. When they entered the basement, the air was denser than ever. The echoes of the whispers were still present, but now they were more intense, almost as if the house was communicating with them directly. The diary that Mark had left on the table the night before was gone. In its place there was something else. An old toy box, covered with dust, was in the center of the floor. Julia bent down to look, her trembling hand almost touching the object. Inside the box was a porcelain doll, with empty blue eyes and a bewildering expression. She seemed harmless at first sight, but there was something about her that made Julia's heart jump. "She was there last night," Mark whispered, watching the doll with apprehension. "But, who left this here?" Julia asked, the voice now tense. They were sure none of those things were there before. It was then that something caught his attention. At the bottom of the box, hidden under a layer of aged fabrics, was a torn piece of paper, yellowed by time. Mark took it carefully and unrolled it. It was a letter, written in childish handwriting but conveying a sense of urgency and despair. "I know what they want from me. They say I have to do what they say, or I'll never see my family again. I can't let them get me. Emily, help me." Julia swallowed dry, feeling a wave of nausea. The letter seemed to have been written by someone in a state of total panic, someone who felt he was being forced to act according to an external will. As Mark examined the letter, Julia looked around, the weight of everything that was going on finally falling on her. They were involved in something much bigger than they thought, something that was not simply the whim of an old house. The presence that inhabited the house, the voices, the messages, everything seemed to be leading them to an unknown and dangerous destination. And somehow the Warren family became part of it, perhaps even chosen for a role they could not yet fully understand. As they rose to leave the basement, the doll seemed to observe with her empty eyes, as if she knew more than she let on. The feeling that the house was controlling their movements, their decisions, grew every day. The past and present were intertwining in an impossible way to escape. The tension in the house was unbearable. Mark and Julia knew they were running out of time, as if the house was squeezing them, forcing them to make decisions that they still could not understand. The whispers became cries, clear and unmistakable. They were no longer simple voices in the air, but orders, threats, and desperate requests. The presence in the house was growing, dominating everything that touched, and it seemed that every day they were closer to being consumed. That night, a storm formed on the horizon. The wind howled outside, making the trees swing with force, as if nature was being dragged by the same invisible force that had kept them prisoners in the house. The children had gone to bed early, unaware of the growing threat hanging over them. Mark and Julia were upstairs in the room, trying to find a logical explanation for all that, although they knew, deep down, that logic no longer had any place there. "I can't take it anymore," Julia said, her voice full of panic. "We need to get out, Mark. We need to get out now." But he couldn't. Something was holding him, a force that he couldn't see, but felt in every bone of his body. He knew something was about to happen, something they couldn't help. Emily's diary, the letter, the doll, all indicated that the fate of the house was intertwined with the fate of his family. Suddenly the light blinked and went out, leaving them in darkness. The sound of the storm became louder, as if the walls of the house were about to break. It was when they heard the footsteps. Gentle but clear steps, like those of a child, slowly descending the stairs. Julia stood up quickly, her eyes wide open. "Mark, did you hear that?" He nodded, throat dry. There was no doubt. The voices they had heard before were now real. And the presence they feared was there before them. With his heart racing, Mark took the flashlight and pointed the light at the stairs. Nothing. The darkness seemed to swallow everything, as if the house was trying to hide what was about to happen. Then in the gloom they saw a small, hooded figure with a torn linen dress as if it had come out of a nightmare. His eyes were dark, empty, and his face displayed a contorted, horrible smile. "I said you couldn't run," the figure muttered, the unmistakable voice of a child but with something deeply wrong in it. "You belong to me now." The house seemed to be breathing, the air dense and heavy. Mark and Julia tried to back off, but before they could react, a wave of cold energy enveloped them, as if the space itself was becoming a living nightmare. The figure walked towards them, the gentle steps but laden with an overwhelming power. They could not move. "I am Emily," the figure whispered, the voice now changing, twisting, as if something evil had taken hold of her. "I was the first. Now it's your turn." The whispers returned, now deafening screams from all directions. The whole house was alive, pulsating, as if it were a being with a mind of its own. Mark and Julia, without strength to resist, fell on their knees, the pain and fear consuming them. They could not escape, there was no way out. The storm outside roared, but now it seemed that everything was being swallowed up by the darkness of the house. Emily's voices, distorted and screaming, echoed through the house as Mark and Julia, in a last desperate effort, clung to each other. But there was no time left. They had been absorbed into the house, as had Emily, like all the other souls that had been captured there before. The dawn brought absolute silence to Maplewood. The house looked quiet, as if nothing had happened. But deep in the property, the former residents of Maplewood, those who had whispered for decades, watched on the other side, waiting for more. They knew the house would never rest. And so, the story of Emily, and now of Mark and Julia, became one more among many that had been forgotten in the pages of time. The house would continue, waiting for the next victim. And the whispers would never cease. They were part of the house now, and the house, as always, was part of them. I never believed in superstitions. I always found these stories of haunted houses and vengeful spirits somewhat exaggerated. When Lucas suggested we buy that house in the country, I was excited. Wanted peace in the country, away from the hustle and bustle of the city, where we could start again. We had no idea what awaited us. The house was small, with that simple charm that only an old building can have. There was an abandoned garden in front, covered by a dense grass, and the roof was of a dark color, as if time had decided to paint it gray. When we came in, the air was heavy, but I didn't think much about it. I just wanted that to be our home. At first, everything seemed normal. Lucas and I put things together, we put furniture in, painted the walls. Everything seemed perfect, a secluded retreat where we could meet after years of stress in our lives in the city. But something was wrong. The first night, the sound started. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was just the wind, but it was a strange sound. Metallic. As if something was crawling through the walls. "It's just the floorboards," Lucas said, but the truth is I couldn't stop hearing. The sound was not coming from the floor, but from the walls. Sometimes it seemed that someone was tapping lightly with a wrench on the wall, other times, the sound was deeper, as if something was crawling, made of rusty metal. The first days were quiet, but with time, the sounds became more constant. At dawn, I woke up, still with the metallic echo ringing in my ears. I looked at Lucas, who was sleeping deeply, without hearing anything. I wanted to wake him up, but I didn't want to look silly. After all, what could it be? A rat? A gas pipe that's not fitting? It just didn't seem like anything. On a rainy afternoon, while Lucas was in town to pick up more furniture, I decided to explore the house a little further. In the attic, I found an old box, full of rusty objects and some photos. The box seemed to have been opened a long time ago, and the smell of mold made me cough. I opened one of the photos and saw something that made me stop for a moment. It was an old picture of a house, our house, but without the touch-ups of the renovation. It was simpler, but something in the photo made me feel a shiver. What bothered me, however, was not the house, but what was in the foreground. It was an iron railing. A funeral railing. I didn't know what it meant at that time. He did not know that the funeral bars were used to imprison the spirits of the dead who could not follow them into the afterlife. I didn't know that the iron that had been used to build our house was not any iron. It had belonged to a local cemetery. A graveyard with a macabre history, where those who died could not rest, where their souls were imprisoned in iron bars. When Lucas came back, he said nothing about what I found. I tried to throw it aside, convinced that it was just a coincidence, but the truth is that a strange feeling settled in me. Something was wrong with the house, and now I knew it wasn't just the metallic sound that bothered me. That night, the sound came louder. It was no longer just a sound of scratching or something being dragged. It was as if something was hitting the walls, forcing the house to move. I stayed awake, feeling the fear growing inside me. But Lucas, as always, slept deeply, not noticing anything. I wanted to tell him, but something told me he would not believe. Then, that morning, hearing the metallic sound again, I took courage. I got up from my bed and went to the dark corridor. The sound came from behind the wall, where I knew the iron had been used in the construction. I approached the wall and put my hand on it. The metal was cold, much more than it should be. And it was at that moment I realized, it wasn't just the iron that was there. Something else was stuck there. Something I could not see, but certainly could feel. And I knew, without a doubt, that the house was not just old. She was carrying something within her, something evil, and was beginning to complain about us. In the days that followed, the metallic sounds did not disappear. They became more frequent and taller, almost as if the house was trying to communicate with us. Lucas tried to convince me that it was normal for an old house to make these kinds of noises. I wanted to believe him, I wanted so much to be true. But inside, I knew something was very wrong. I started to sleep badly. Every night, the sounds intensified. It was as if the metals within the walls were twisting and bending, as if they were alive. And whenever I tried to fall asleep, the sound seemed to get worse, closer to me, as if I was the target of some invisible force. On the third night, the sound of metallic scratches was interrupted by a crash. A painting that had been carefully hung on the wall fell to the floor with such a loud bang that I almost screamed. I stood up immediately, but before I could approach to see what had happened, another sound, louder, filled the environment, as if a chair was being dragged across the wooden floor. I looked at Lucas, but he was sleeping, still, as if nothing had happened. The fear was beginning to consume me. But the worst was not the picture or the noise. The worst was what I saw next. The next morning, when Lucas went out to get more groceries, I decided to look at the house a little bit more. I went upstairs and, as I passed through a narrow corridor, I saw something that made the blood in my veins freeze. One of the doors was open. Never seen it open before. And as I entered, I found the chair, the same one that seemed to have moved around the house, now back in its place. But something was different. The wall behind the chair was marked with deep scratches, as if something had tried to get out of there. I touched the marks. They were cold and, as I pressed, a strange sensation ran through my arm, as if something was trying to pull me into the wall. I backed quickly, my heart beating fast. That's when I found the diary. Behind, almost as if no one had touched it for a long time. The diary was old, the pages yellow and brittle. I opened it, hesitant, and began to read. The words were written in a hasty, almost desperate way, and spoke of the cemetery that existed before the house was built. The cemetery where the bodies of the dead were buried without respect, where the spirits were imprisoned in iron bars that were now incorporated into the structure of our house. The diary mentioned dark rituals done to keep spirits captive, but also warned that in time these spirits would begin to revolt. "Don't go near the iron," said one of the last entries. "They are waiting to come out. They want revenge." I almost closed the diary, but one last sentence made me stop. "No matter what I do, a soul will be sacrificed." I trembled reading this. What did they mean by that? And who, or what, was really trapped in the walls of our house? When Lucas came back, I was in shock. He noticed my condition and asked me what had happened, but I couldn't tell him. The fear that he would not believe me paralyzed me. Instead, I showed him the diary, and he just laughed. "That's just an old story, Mariana. It's nothing but superstition," he said, trying to calm me down. But I knew it wasn't superstition. I knew that what was inside that house wasn't just a story. That night, the sound came back, louder than ever. I was awake when I heard it. It wasn't a simple scratch anymore. It was something heavy, something that was forcing the walls, as if wanting to leave. I heard clearly the sound of bars being forced, metal hitting metal, coming from inside the wall behind me. I tried to wake Lucas, but he didn't. He seemed to be in a deep sleep, as if something was keeping him there, stuck. I knew we could no longer ignore it. Something was in our house. Something that should not be there. And I had no more doubts, we were not alone. In the following days, I could not take away the feeling that something was approaching us. The metallic sounds became more intense, more constant, and the house seemed to be breathing, as if the iron in its walls had life of its own. I knew it was no longer a matter of superstition. Something was stuck there, something evil, and it was beginning to manifest. Lucas finally realized he couldn't ignore what was happening. He started to worry too, though he didn't know what to do. We started to look more about the history of the house and the cemetery that was before it. It was as if a weight were crushing us, and as we discovered more, the air inside the house became denser, harder to breathe. We spent days in the local library, talking to the oldest inhabitants of the city, and the story that we were discovering was terrifying. The cemetery where the bodies were buried was not any cemetery. It was built on an ancient battlefield, where many died in violent and painful circumstances. The city, like some others, had its legends about souls who found no rest. But what no one knew was that the iron bars used to imprison the dead had been forged for a sinister purpose, to keep the souls of the condemned trapped in a metal prison. The house in which we now lived, before it was built, had been erected over the cemetery, using the iron remains of these funeral grates. And, contrary to what they had told us, these spirits were not released. They had been imprisoned, feeling all the pain and anger of their deaths, waiting for the right moment to take revenge. Lucas and I tried to move on, but as we understood more, the feeling of oppression in the house became stronger. There was something in every wall, in every corner, that watched us, as if the house itself was alive and aware of our presence. That night, something happened that made me sure there was no turning back. I was lying in bed, trying to sleep, when I heard a noise coming from the corridor. It wasn't the metallic sound before. It was something more human. As if someone was dragging their feet on the ground, trying to get up. I went to the door of the room and, as I opened it, I saw a shadow passing quickly through the corridor. She looked human but had no clear shape. It was like a dark silhouette, a spot of darkness that moved against the dim light of the lamp. I screamed, but Lucas didn't wake up. I walked into the hallway, trying to reach the shadow, but when I got in the room, there was no one. The silence was absolute, and the house seemed to be waiting for something. My heart beat fast. I knew that was not a nightmare, but something real. Something that was hunting us. I began to realize that things did not move by chance. The chair that crawled in the corridor, the pictures that fell down by themselves, the doors that opened and closed without explanation, all was part of a pattern. Something was trying to communicate to us. I didn't know what, but felt we needed to understand more about those souls trapped there. As we explored more, we found an old ritual book in the attic. It was hidden among the old objects, and when Luke leafed it out, it became pale. The book talked about ways to free souls trapped in iron bars. But he also warned that, in trying to free them, something more terrible would take the place of souls, an even more powerful force, which could not be controlled. I felt a shiver in my spine when I read these words. What did they mean by a more powerful force? And if these souls were released, what would happen to us? That night, as I went to bed, I felt more watched than ever. The walls seemed to vibrate, as if the house was absorbing all the energy around us. The pressure inside me was unbearable. I knew we couldn't stand there anymore. Something was about to happen, and I didn't know if we were ready to face it. I turned to Lucas, who finally seemed to realize what was happening, but before I could speak he looked at the wall with his eyes wide open. I followed his gaze and, in the corner of the room, the metal wall was warping, as if something tried to come out of it. And I heard, clearly, a voice. Low, drawn, and full of pain. You cannot escape. It was a voice that did not come from a living person. It was as if it were coming out of the house itself, from inside the iron. And at that moment, I knew that whatever was there, it was closer than ever. The house was different that night. The air seemed dense, charged with strange electricity, and the walls trembled, as if they were about to disintegrate under the weight of something that could not be contained for much longer. Luke and I were silent, watching, waiting. The voice we heard the night before still echoed in our minds. You cannot escape. The metallic sounds that started to make themselves heard from then on were no longer as before. They weren't just scratches or hits on the iron. They were screams, crawling down the hall like desperate souls trying to find a way out. I knew that it was iron, that the metal that made up the structure of the house was being invaded by those entities, forcing the invisible chains that imprisoned them. I didn't want to, but something inside me pushed me to look for a solution. The ritual book was open on the table, its pages undone by use, as if it was watching us, waiting for us to make a decision. Luke, we have to do this, I said, low and trembling. We need to try to free them. We have to end this before it's too late. But Luke, now pale and astonished, looked at me with eyes full of fear. Free them? The book says that something worse will come. Mariana, didn't you hear what they said? This house, this iron, everything was done to imprison these souls. If we do that, they will be released, but what's next? I knew what he meant, but the words were stuck in my throat. Was that what we wanted? Or would it be an unsustainable risk? In silence, I made the decision. I took the book in my hands and began to recite the words of the ritual, following the steps indicated, with a fast heart. Every word seemed to make the house shake more intensely. I felt the presence of the entities around us. I felt their anger, their suffering, but also a kind of relief. As if they were waiting for it. The iron, the metal, was being dissolved, as if an invisible layer was being broken. Suddenly, the house made a deafening noise, as if all the weight of a great evil was being lifted. The air around us became heavy, suffocating. An intense light began to shine through the cracks of the walls, and it was then that the entities showed themselves. I saw figures materializing, distorted shadows taking shape before us, but they were not human. They were entities made of iron, as if the metal had turned into flesh. Their eyes were empty, lifeless, and their mouths opened in a silent cry, as if they wanted to take revenge for all that they had suffered. They were there, inside us, in our minds, taking possession of every space, consuming everything. Before I could react, Lucas cried. He was dragged to the back of the room by an invisible force. I ran towards him, but something pulled me back, as if the walls of the house had become a force field. I tried to fight, but the pressure was overwhelming. Mariana, I love you. Lucas shouted, his words being swallowed by a metallic sound. He was disappearing, becoming part of the house, as if absorbed by the structure itself. I tried to reach his hand, but before he could, it disintegrated, its form dissolving in a whirlwind of metal and shadows. I was alone. The ritual was complete. The souls had been freed, but something worse had taken their place. The house was now alive with a new force, a force that could not be controlled. I knew deep down that the release of the imprisoned souls had not really freed them. They had become something worse. I didn't know if I was dreaming or if what I saw was real, but the moment the house started to crumble around me, a last image stuck in my mind. The figure of Luke, or what remained of him, now part of the iron that formed the walls, with empty eyes, staring at me. And all I could hear, in the end, was a soft whisper, which seemed to come from within me, "You cannot escape." The house was quiet again, but I knew that somehow it was lost there forever. I didn't know what to expect from that house. When we moved into the Holloway mansion, it was like a big step, a new beginning. What could we find, after all, in such a distant place of the city? After all these years, Elizabeth and I needed something like this, a fresh start. When she first saw the property, I thought the idea of an old and imposing house in the heart of New England was just a reflection of her hope for something new, a life that would restart away from the city's tiring routine. Not that she hesitated. Elizabeth was always the dreamer. The first night was quiet, but still strange. The air was charged, as if something in the house was waiting for us to become aware of its presence. But I was skeptical. I always have been. Even when the house seemed quieter than it should be for a century-old building, I ignored it, attributing to the old building its peculiar charm. The entrance hall had a smell of aged wood and mold, something that seemed to seep into our clothes and lungs. The floor of planks rangia with the weight of our past, as if the house was aware of our presence. Elizabeth and I tried our best to make it cozy, but no matter how much we put furniture and paintings on the walls, there was a constant feeling that that house would never really be ours. On the first few nights, things started to get a little uncomfortable. Nothing very extraordinary, of course. but even for a rational man like me, I couldn't help noticing. I woke up at night, feeling as if something was in the hallway, right on the door of my room. A sound, as if someone was walking, but no one was there. At first, I thought it was just the sound of the wind, or maybe the sound of old pipes. I know that I was convinced of it, but the feeling of being watched, did not disappear. Ben, my oldest son, also noticed. He mentioned, jokingly, that the house was talking to him. He didn't look scared, but there was something in his eyes that made me think he knew more than he was letting on. Sarah, our eldest daughter, didn't care about any of this. For her, the move was an opportunity to explore a new place, but even she, in her silent rebellion, seemed to keep a certain distance from home. It was Emma, our youngest daughter, who started telling us about weirder things. She was in her room one night, alone, when she ran to our room crying. Her voice trembled as she told me she had seen something. I thought it was just a nightmare, but something in her gaze made me stop. She said a shadowy figure was standing at the foot of her bed, looking at her. And the strangest, what froze inside me, was what she said next. The figure whispered something to her. Words she could not understand completely, but something about the past of the house, something too old for her to know. I reassured her, thinking that maybe it was just a mix of fear and imagination, a reflection of the stories she had heard in previous nights. After all, we were in a new place, a big and strange place, and it's natural that children like Emma are scared of things they don't understand. But when the fear was stamped on his face, something in me began to question. I was never the kind of person to believe in ghosts or things beyond reason, but after that night, I became uncomfortable in ways I could not explain. The next morning, after trying to get Emma back to sleep, I decided to take a look at the house. It was not possible that what she saw was real, but something was bothering me, and it made me more angry than scared. I tried to go down the hall to check if there was anything out of place, but everything was quiet. No door moved, no strange sound. Only the echo of my own past. I must be going crazy, I thought. But then, as I returned to Emma's room, something caught my attention. The picture hanging on the wall was slightly tilted, as if it had been moved. I don't remember touching it. And then a sound, a soft but sharp snap, came from the corridor. I went back to the living room and found Elizabeth, who seemed as quiet as ever. But when I asked if she had heard anything, she simply shook her head, saying no. I knew she was trying to keep calm, but something in her tone, perhaps the hesitation in her eyes, made me think that she wasn't as carefree as she pretended. As the night fell, and once again the house was filled with that deep silence, I saw myself questioning the shadows that stretched out through the corridor. Emma's words resonated in my mind. The house had secrets we didn't know, and something told me they wouldn't be easy to find out. In the following days, the feeling of discomfort did not disappear. On the contrary, it seemed to be growing every night. I didn't know for sure what was going on in the house, but the sounds, whispers and objects moving by themselves were affecting me more than I would like to admit. Emma, more than ever, seemed to be at the center of everything. She kept talking about the dark figure, describing it in more detail each time. She said that the figure was always watching, that she knew things about the house that no one else knew. When we asked what exactly the figure said, she hesitated, as if she was afraid to tell. The most disturbing was when she began to say that the figure called her by name, as if he already knew her from somewhere. She mentioned that the figure told her about something that happened in the house a long time ago. Deep down, I knew that Emma wasn't making it all up. She seemed scared, but there was also a confidence in her words, something I could not ignore. As the days passed, the house seemed to become more alive. At first, the footsteps in the corridor were sporadic, but now, every night, the heavy walk seemed to come closer to our room. Always when I looked at the clock, same time, 3 o'clock in the morning. It was as if some kind of force or entity were concentrating at that particular time. Elizabeth began to get nervous, and I could see the fear in her eyes as she lay down in bed. We tried to keep calm for the children, but in moments of absolute silence, when I was alone, I felt a strange presence, as if being observed. Ben, my oldest son, who was always more rational, began to worry too. He refused to sleep in his own room and said that he felt something watching him. I tried to reason with him, saying that it was okay, but I knew deep down he wasn't just trying to avoid the dark. He told me that at night, when I passed through the hall, I heard whispers, but could not understand what they were saying. As much as I tried to rationalize the situation, a part of me knew it wasn't just paranoia. The drop of water was when the paintings on the walls began to move. They were not large displacements, but small and imperceptible. I was in one of the corridors, doing my rounds, when I saw a picture frame move slightly, as if something had pressed the back wall. I went to him, trying to explain what could have caused that, but there was nothing that made sense. The picture was firm, but the feeling that something was wrong was undeniable. It was Emma, again, who brought out the greatest mystery. She found an old diary hidden behind a wall in the library. Apparently, the house had secret passages, something I did not know until then. The diary was covered with dust and pages yellowed by time, but as soon as you opened it, it shut. The content was disturbing. It was the writing of someone who lived in the house in the 19th century, detailing occult rituals that took place there, rituals of invocation and worship to forces beyond human comprehension. She brought me the diary, and I, although skeptical, could not ignore what I read. The diary talked about the shadow cult, a sect that, according to the writings, performed rituals inside the mansion. They invoked entities from other dimensions, seeking power and immortality. There were mentions of disappearances, mysterious deaths, and a presence that was said to be eternal. Each word was more disturbing than the previous one. My mind was in a whirl. I wondered how such a thing could have happened there, but the details were too clear to be ignored. Something in that house was keeping those secrets, something that didn't want to be discovered. I tried to keep calm, especially for Elizabeth, who was visibly altered. I convinced her to look for more about the history of the house, and we went to the small town nearby, looking for answers. But when we talked to the older residents, no one wanted to talk about the past of the Holloway mansion. They looked at us with fear, as if we were mad to even mention it. But finally, a very old lady, with tired eyes and marked by age face, told us something that froze inside me. The house never lets those who enter it go unharmed. What happened there should not be remembered. The feeling that we were being watched, that the house was somehow alive, increased every day. Whatever was trapped there didn't want to leave the Holloway family alone. And the worst of all was to know that, the more we investigated, the more our presence seemed to feed what was lurking. That house, which at first seemed a new beginning, now became a nightmare. It was impossible to deny, something was watching us, chasing us. Phenomena that were once punctual and isolated now happened at any time, with a frightening frequency. Every night seemed to bring something new. The sound of footsteps in the corridor was no longer just a distant echo, now, it was clear and loud, as if someone were approaching our room, stopping right at the door and waiting. When I opened the door, the corridor was empty. There was no one. What made me even more upset was the fact that it wasn't just Emma reporting these events. Ben, Sarah, and even Elizabeth began to realize the same things. It was an indescribable sensation. The air became heavier, the light in the lamps suddenly went out, and the heat dissipated as if the very spirit of the house was swallowing the energy around us. At first I was still trying to rationalize, but now as the days went by, the feeling of persecution seemed too real to ignore. We were being watched, hunted by something that inhabited the mansion. One night, I was woken by a loud knock on my room door. It wasn't Emma, it wasn't anyone in the family. I stood up quickly, feeling a shiver in my spine. When I opened the door, the corridor was empty except for a cold air current that seemed to emanate from the end of the corridor. It was as if space itself was trying to push me away, keep me away from somewhere. I looked back, where Elizabeth was still sleeping, but the fear was paralyzing me. In a desperate attempt to understand what was happening, I decided to confront whatever was there. Went to the library and spent hours reading the diary that Emma had found. I needed to understand more about the shadow cult and the rituals mentioned. Each page was more macabre than the previous, describing ceremonies with words that had no meaning for me, but somehow seemed to invoke an evil presence. A presence that was said to be able to take physical form and to persecute anyone who dared interact with what was kept there. That same night, Emma had another nightmare. She woke up in the middle of the night screaming, saying the dark figure was behind me. "She's gonna get you, Daddy," she said, her eyes filled with fear. It was as if she knew something neither I nor Elizabeth could understand. And then the feeling that we were being hunted intensified. The doors began to slam on their own, with a force that seemed to want to tear them from their hinges. The objects that disappeared were no longer just small items, but larger things, furniture, books, and even clothes that disappeared from our closets. And the most terrifying, every morning, wet hand marks appeared on mirrors, windows, and even walls. They were big hands, deformed, as if something was trying to get in. But it wasn't just the environment in the house that got heavier. People themselves started to change. Ben, who was always a full-bodied boy, became closed, withdrawn, as if being consumed by something invisible. Sarah, who did not believe in any of this, began to question everything around us, but without ever really understanding what was happening. And Elizabeth, she was on the edge. I saw her tired eyes, her lost look. I knew she didn't know what to think anymore, but something in me told me that she was seeing things she didn't want to admit. However, the breaking point happened one night when something real, something physical, attacked us. It was about 3 in the morning when we heard a high-pitched scream. Emma was alone in her room, and her cry woke us immediately. I ran there, with my heart pounding, and found her bedroom door open, the light on, but Emma wasn't in her bed. I looked around, and then I saw her reflection in the mirror of the corridor. She was standing, looking into the void, still. I called her by name, but she didn't move. I tried to pull her, but she was stiff, as if being controlled by something. Her eyes were blank, lifeless, and the only thing she whispered was, "He's coming." The feeling of dread was instantaneous. It was as if the whole house was in tune with what was happening. I knew it was no longer just the presence of a spirit. Something evil, something powerful, was there, waiting to consume us. And the worst part was that I didn't know how to stop it. I didn't know what I could do. When we finally got Emma out of the mirror, she fell into my arms, crying, desperate. I knew she had seen something. She knew more than I did. But what terrified me was what happened next. When I looked in the mirror, her reflection was no longer there. Just a shadow, an indistinct figure, that seemed to move behind the glass. And then I knew, we weren't just being watched. We were the hunt. I knew there was no way back. Whatever was behind us, watching us, hunting us, wouldn't stop until it got what it wanted. I no longer knew who I was in that house, or what was left of my family. All I had were the pages of that damn diary of Emma, and one last hope, the possibility to do something before it was too late. That night, the house seemed alive. The sound of footsteps, of the banging, of the doors closing themselves, everything was intensified. I knew that was the final night. They wanted us to get there. They knew we were weak, that we could no longer fight alone. And then what I feared most happened. I was sitting in the office, staring at Emma's diary when the door opened. It wasn't a wind, it wasn't the sound of a knock. No. The door opened of its own accord. I did not know if it was the spirit or something else, something that could no longer be called spirit. Something heavy, with power. When I looked at the door, I saw a shadow creeping across the floor, distorting the light of the lamp. It was not a human figure. It was something grotesque, that fed on the darkness, and I knew that I was no longer part of this world. At the end of the corridor, I saw the doors to the children's rooms slowly opening, one after another. The feeling of cold was increasing, and the whispers that Emma had heard the night she met the figure began to become clearer. The name of the former owner of the house, the name that echoed in his dreams, now seemed to repeat itself in my head, a name I had never heard before, but which was now tattooed on my mind. "Ezekiel Holloway," said the voice, as if it were inside me. "He will return." I didn't know who or what Ezekiel was, but I knew the name was connected to something very old. Something that made the house what it was. As if he were the man who created evil, who sowed the curse of generations ago. In despair, I went to the basement, where the diary mentioned ancient rituals, the practice of summoning entities that could inhabit the flesh and soul. I didn't know what I expected to find, but instinct guided me there. When I arrived, I found something that I will never forget, the symbol of a circle, formed by burning candles and ashes. The smell of burnt incense hit me like a wave, and in the middle of the gloom I saw the shadow materializing. It was him, Ezekiel. Or at least what was left of it. It was a deformed figure, half human, half shadow, with completely white eyes and mouth full of sharp teeth. He approached me without making a sound, as if the gravity was too weak for him. And in a guttural whisper, he said, "You have invoked the past, and now the future is mine." At that moment, I saw the images pass before my eyes, the rituals, the victims, the cries that echoed in the house when the former residents had tried to banish the entity that now took over the place. All had failed. And now we were next. But, in the bottom, a last idea emerged: sacrifice. What Emma's diary described as a possibility, a last attempt at destruction, was terrible, but it was the only chance left. A final ritual, a sacrifice of blood that would seal the house and its horrors forever. There were no guarantees, but I could not let it consume us anymore. I knew that it would not be easy. With the last shred of strength, we invoked what was left of courage. I gathered the family in the main room. They were weak, with empty eyes and expressions paralyzed by terror, but there was something in our hearts that still burned, something that told us we needed to fight. As Ezekiel's shadow advanced, I prepared the ritual. An old knife, the blood of the family, the circle of protection, and the words we needed to say. He tried to stop us, projecting himself against us with force, but the resistance was stronger. The last word was spoken, and when the blade touched the ground, everything seemed to stop. The air compressed, the sound stopped, and then a bang. A bright, warm and blinding light took over everything. Ezekiel shouted, a sound that cracked the windows of the house, before his form was swallowed by the light, diluted in the same energy that had brought him. When the light was gone, the mansion returned to absolute silence. There was something different in the air. The weight that accompanied us all this time dissipated, and the runners were finally calm. But there was a cost. The house was clean, but at a terrible cost. Emma, Ben, Sarah and Elizabeth were beside me, but something in their eyes had changed. They were there, physically intact, but something was lost. The bond that once united us, was now fragmented. The house, though freed from evil, had left marks on us that could never be erased. Looked forward, where the door of the mansion was open, the light of dawn lighting the way. We knew we needed to leave. The house we had called home, however empty it was now of its shadows, was no longer ours. The past had marked her irreparably. And as I crossed the threshold of the door, something within me knew, evil never disappears completely. He just waits.